Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the University of Hong Kong. It's a great pleasure to see all of you here this evening. I'm Professor Daniel Chua. I am the director of the Faith and Global Engagement Initiative. When we planned this distinguished lecture many, many moons ago, we had absolutely no idea that the topic of law and justice would be the explosive, divisive issue in Hong Kong that would create unprecedented social turmoil. And of course, when we first invited David Skeel, our speaker this evening, to give his talk, he had no idea that I would be dropping him into this boiling cauldron of a controversy this evening. So I'm not sure whether I should be introducing David or apologizing really to David for throwing him into this rather scary situation. But I'm delighted that he is here because the mission really of the Faith and Global Engagement Initiative is to be in conversation with difficult and contemporary and relevant issues today, and nothing could be more potently up-to-date and relevant than the issue of justice and law. So I'm very grateful that you're here, David, today. Now, David Skeel officially is the S. Samuel Arsht Professor of Corporate Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He's published very widely, of course, on corporate law, but also on bankruptcy law, debt relief and sovereign bankruptcy, law and poetry, as well as law and religion. But he's not just a cloistered academic that works in his ivory tower. He's also very much a public commentator in the media, and his commentaries have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Weekly Standard, and so on. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, David. So please join me in welcoming Professor David Skeel as he gives his talk.
So thanks, Daniel, and thanks to all of y'all for coming. And I am not going to be talking directly about the boiling cauldron in my initial remarks. So if y'all want to talk about that, we'll talk about that in the Q&A, and I will be listening as much as talking. So I have some good news and some bad news about the talk I'm about to give for the next few minutes. The good news is it's only 30 minutes long, so it's not going to be 45 minutes. It's not going to be an hour. We'll have plenty of time for questions. The bad news is there's a lot of information and a lot of ideas in the talk. So if it puts you to sleep, don't worry about it. We'll unpack everything in the question and answer because there's a lot of material in it for the next 30 minutes. Many of you probably know the song, "Do You Hear the People Sing?" from the movie and play Les Miserables, which is based on the wonderful and very, very long novel by Victor Hugo. In fact, I've seen pictures of banners here in Hong Kong that say, "Do you hear the people sing?" and news reports back in the US of people in Hong Kong singing the song. For those of you who've not actually seen Les Miserables, Jean Valjean, the hero, is thrown in jail after he steals bread to feed his starving family and is hounded by an inspector named Javert, who represents the French legal system. A group of students in Paris later try to start a new revolution to protest the mistreatment of the poor in France at this time, which was the early 1830s. What's most interesting to me for the purposes of the question that we'll be asking and talking about together tonight is the nature of the French legal system that made much of this oppression, the oppression in Les Miserables, possible. You might think that the French laws in place at this time must have been awful, unjust laws, but they weren't. The French legal system consisted of the Napoleonic Criminal Code, which regulated criminal law in France, and the General Napoleonic Code, which governed commercial and family law and other issues of legal process. The Napoleonic Code, particularly the General Code, is actually quite beautiful. So beautiful that the famous 19th century French novelist who went by the name Stendhal, and who's the author of the novel The Red and the Black, said that he read 2 or 3 pages of the Napoleonic Code every day, the Napoleonic Code, the law, to improve his own writing style. Napoleon and his allies in the French Revolution of 1789 had thought that with the Napoleonic Code they could create a fully just society. The Napoleonic Code, as amended, is still in place in France and in Italy, and it has influenced a number of other countries in Europe and elsewhere as well, even today. And yet, the same laws that seem so beautiful and so just were responsible for a great injustice. Les Miserables is fiction, of course, and it's exaggerated in many ways, but the story, both parts of the story, the beginning part of the story about Jean Valjean and the later story about the Revolution, both parts are based on actual incidents in early 19th century France. Over and over throughout human history, we find a very similar pattern. In the prologue to Hammurabi's Code, one of the earliest legal codes, Hammurabi writes that, and quoting, the god Marduk commanded me to provide just ways for the people of the land in order to attain appropriate behavior. And he vowed that the laws would, once again, I'm quoting here, establish truth and justice as the declaration of the land. But from everything that we know about ancient Babylonia, its society fell far short of perfect justice. The founders of my own country, the United States, were in many respects quite realistic about justice. We have a system of checks and balances that's designed to protect against abuses by requiring that the president and 2 different branches of the legislature agree to any legislation before it goes into effect. That's why we don't have any legislation these days in the United States. And our Constitution also provides for judicial review of the legislation. In many respects, the United States is a very just system. But more than half of all prisoners in our jails are black, even though blacks are only 10 or 12% of the population as a whole. 33% of black men who do not have a university degree will spend part of their lives in jail in the United States. And for black men who do not finish secondary school, the percentage is 60%. This certainly doesn't sound like perfect justice. A few years ago, many people were quite optimistic about the Arab Spring, the movement that toppled dictatorships and unpopular governments in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. Many people were optimistic that the Arab Spring would bring stable, successful democracies to the Middle East. So far, the results have been disastrous. The governments in some of these countries are even less stable and more oppressive than they were before the Arab Spring. Why is it that we invariably think that if we just put the right legal or political system in place, we can finally create a fully just social order, even though every previous system has failed? In my new book, that I've just published called True Paradox: How Christianity Makes Sense of Our Complex World, I call the pattern that I've just described the justice paradox. And there is a chapter in the book called the justice paradox that has many of the ideas that I'm sharing with you tonight. You may be surprised to hear that I, a professor at a leading American law school, think the Christian worldview can explain the justice paradox better than any other religion or system of thought. You may think of Christianity as an ancient and obsolete worldview. An atheist friend of mine, who I spent a lot of time talking with about the ideas in the book, described Christianity to me in an email about the book that he sent me along with comments on the book before it was published. He described Christianity, and keep in mind, this is a friend of mine. This is not somebody who dislikes me. He described my set of beliefs, Christianity, as, quote, not much more than a human creation of Bronze Age peasants derived from wholly unexceptional and largely fictional narratives. Otherwise, he thought Christianity was pretty impressive. So how could Christianity possibly be relevant to our 21st century challenges? Christianity's explanation of the justice paradox is one part of the answer. I believe that Christianity actually makes more sense, not less, than other religions or systems of thought, of the justice paradox, and many other puzzling features of our subjective experience of the world, such as the feeling of transcendence we have in the presence of beauty, and the horror we experience when we see or encounter suffering. Christianity teaches that optimism about our own ability to usher in utopia by our own lawmaking is a central and destructive feature of human nature. In the story of Adam and Eve, a foundational text for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim understandings of human nature, the first humans fell because they believed that they were capable of becoming like God and redefining the laws of the universe. This theme recurs and is repeated all throughout the Old Testament of the Bible. But the New Testament and Christianity goes even further. Christianity, unlike any other major religion or system of thought, bases its salvation narrative on a story in which law fails. Christianity, or the hero of Christianity, is quite literally murdered by law. Jesus of Nazareth was tried twice under both Jewish and Roman law, two of the finest legal systems the ancient world had ever known. He was first tried under trumped-up charges under the Jewish law. False witnesses were used, and the high priest improperly intervened. Then he was tried under Roman law, which provided, as it turned out, several escape hatches, which could have been used to release him. But the escape hatches failed because Pontius Pilate, who was the ruler and the judge, was too weak to use them. Some interesting analogies between Pontius Pilate and Javert, the inspector of Les Miserables. I'm not sure if they're intended or not, but there's some striking similarities in some regards. So the failure of human legal systems lies at the very heart of the Christian story. As a Christian, I believe that we're incapable of achieving a truly just society on our own because we've rebelled against the ultimate lawgiver. But I also believe that the ruler of the universe has stepped in the person of Jesus Christ, to restore justice by taking our injustice on himself. So the Christian worldview rests on a skepticism about our ability to establish justice on the basis of our own moral improvement. But at the same time, it offers us a basis for justice that is, to my mind, unsurpassed. The Christian understanding of justice starts with the biblical principle that each one of us, whatever our race, gender, status, or physical and mental infirmities, is made in the image of God, and that our most fundamental need is for a restored relationship with God and with each other. So what does this have to do with societal justice? Firstly, it gives us a grounding for human rights and for the principle that laws should be transparent, defined in advance, and applied to everyone in the same way. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was first adopted in 1948, represents a wonderful achievement, asserting the value of every human being in response to the horrors of the Second World War. But it famously does not rest on any generally agreed upon philosophical foundation or articulation of why every human being is innately valuable. Of course, Christians are not the only ones who believe in human rights. Quite to the contrary, many atheists and adherents of other religions believe deeply in human rights. But a Christian justification for human rights is, I believe, a far firmer foundation than the kinds of justifications offered by top atheist intellectuals, people like the Harvard linguist Steven Pinker or the Australian ethicist, the Harvard linguist Steven Pinker, or the Australian ethicist Peter Singer, who is a professor at Princeton. Singer and others who advocate what I call a materialist or science without God perspective point to some of the trappings of consciousness, such as our ability to make choices about the kind of life we live, as the basis for human dignity. But locating the value of a human being in any specific attribute risks the possibility of grading human value according to those attributes until those who are more intelligent or better able to make choices are viewed as more valuable than those who are not. And materialism, or the science without God view, is in principle compatible with a host of different philosophies, many of which would not show equal value to each human life. Christianity provides a grounding for the value of every human being, irrespective of their incidental attributes, by locating that value in the fact that human beings are created in the image of God. In my own scholarly writing, I've argued that a legal system needs to account not just for the fact that each of us is made in the image of God, but also for the human tendency to misbehave. When most of us think of our legal systems, the need to restrain misbehavior by ordinary citizens, the need for the law to restrain ordinary citizens' misbehavior, is the first thing that comes to mind. But ordinary citizens are not the only ones who are tempted to misbehave. Lawmakers and law enforcers have exactly the same inclinations. They too, in the terminology used in the Bible, are sinful. So an effective legal system must play a double game. It must do two things at the same time if it's going to be effective. It needs to restrain the worst wrongs committed by the citizenry, while at the same time not empowering judges and prosecutors to do wrong themselves. The key to playing this double game well is to limit law's reach. The irony here is that the less we expect from law, the more humility we have about its ability to assure justice, the more effective our laws are likely to be. Jim Whitman, a very fine legal historian at Yale, who's not himself a Christian, gives a lovely illustration of what this might look like, a historical illustration in a book of his called The Origins of Reasonable Doubt. In many legal systems, a criminal suspect cannot be found guilty of a serious crime unless a judge or a jury is persuaded beyond a reasonable doubt, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant in fact committed the crime. If I were to ask you where this beyond a reasonable doubt standard came from, I suspect that most of you would guess, as I would have guessed, that this standard was designed to make sure judges and juries are not too quick to convict a criminal defendant. Thus, that the standard was adopted to restrain overzealous judges and juries. But it turns out, historically speaking, that assumption has things exactly backwards. That the beyond a reasonable doubt standard was not designed to restrain judges and juries at all. In 18th century England, when the standard emerged, Christian judges and juries worshiped a Savior, Jesus Christ, who was himself the victim of wrongful criminal punishment. And they worried, these judges and juries, that they would be condemned to hell if they convicted defendants, notwithstanding doubts about the defendant's guilt. The beyond a reasonable doubt standard, which we now see as a limit on criminal punishment, was actually designed to encourage it by reassuring Christian judges and juries that they could vote to convict without sending themselves to hell if they were absolutely sure that the defendant had in fact committed the crime. Christians were terrified of the consequences of wrongly judging one another. Let me be clear. I don't claim that Christians have always honored the principles I've been describing when we've been in a position to shape the legal system. Whether it was the Roman Empire after Constantine, when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, or the Inquisition in the Roman Empire, or the more recent culture wars debates in the United States, which y'all might have heard a little bit about here in Hong Kong even, or whether it was some of the laws enacted in Africa or Latin America being pushed by Christian folks in those countries and continents in recent decades. We Christians have our own sin that we bring to the table, even as we seek to create what we think of as just laws in whatever culture we live in. But the virtue of Christianity, in my view, as contrasted with nearly any other religion or system of thought, is that Christianity is self-correcting. Napoleon and Hammurabi and many other leaders throughout history thought and taught that with the right legal and political framework, human beings could establish a just moral order. By contrast, when Christians seek to usher in the kingdom of God through law, when Christians think that they can by themselves create a fully just society, they are forgetting how Jesus died and the way he consistently distanced himself from the powerful and strong and aligned himself with the weak and marginalized. They are forgetting Christianity's teachings, not promoting them. In the United States, the most famous example of an attempt to promote justice that backfired was prohibition. Which was a law that was put in place in 1920 in the United States, lasted until 1933. It was a constitutional amendment that made it illegal to manufacture or sell alcohol. But the ban, prohibition's ban on the making, selling, or transporting of alcohol was far too broad for state and federal regulators to actually enforce, and to enforce systematically and fully. As a result of this law, prohibition that was too sweeping to be consistently enforced, regulators had considerable discretion as far as when to enforce it and how, and the discretion invited discrimination. Someone who sold beer to Italian immigrants on the Lower East Side of New York City, which is where the poor neighborhoods in New York City were in the early 20th century, might well be arrested and thrown in jail for selling that beer. If he sold gin to a more elite clientele on the Upper East Side of New York, where the wealthy people lived, by contrast, he was very unlikely to end up in jail. He was much more likely to wind up in an F. Scott Fitzgerald novel. The most familiar example of a successful campaign to achieve justice in America was the Civil Rights Movement, led by Martin Luther King in the 1950s and 1960s. When people think about the Civil Rights Movement, they often assume that the movement was principally intended to reform American law and the American legal system. But Martin Luther King, Jr., the leader of the movement, focused much more on changing hearts than on changing laws. And the two laws that the civil rights movement, or the two main laws that the civil rights movement did inspire, were very unusual, in many respects very surprising laws. Unlike many moral and social reforms in the United States, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were not criminal laws. They weren't designed to put offenders in jail or even designed to impose damages for the wrongs committed against blacks in the past, for slavery and the post-slavery forms of oppression. The objective of the Civil Rights Act, which gave blacks the right to sue if they were discriminated against or are discriminated against, was to give America a more integrated workplace in which blacks and whites could work side by side and can work side by side. The Voting Rights Act created the modern American law of voting rights by protecting the right of blacks to vote, particularly in the southern states of the U.S., which gave America an integrated political community in which blacks and whites and others can vote side by side. The main reason these laws have been so successful, they're not perfect, but they have been astonishingly successful, is that they, unlike so many laws, actually helped to create relationships in American communities. I said earlier that Christianity emphasizes the need for our legal system to play a double game, to do two things at the same time: restraining the misbehavior of ordinary men and women on the one hand, and on the other hand, not inviting lawmakers and law enforcers to misbehave. Christianity teaches that the objective of the laws we do enact, once we decide which laws we actually are going to enact, should be to promote proper relationships within our society, as so beautifully illustrated by the civil rights movement. Using law to create proper relationships is not easy. It nearly always requires a trade-off between equality and freedom. Equality and freedom almost always are in tension with one another in human legal systems. It's not accidental, in my view, that the most famous modern theories of justice, such as John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism or John Rawls's theory of justice, all at bottom focus on this tension and have proposed solutions to this tension between equality and freedom. In practice, we find that laws that create equality in America, and I think this is probably true elsewhere as well, such as preferential treatment in education or hiring for blacks or for the poor or for others who have been disadvantaged through time, almost inevitably require a reduction of the freedom of other groups. But the most successful laws, the most just laws, strike the balance between equality and freedom and help to improve the quality of relationships within a society. People sometimes worry that Christians are too pessimistic about justice. And you may think from what I've said that Christians are too pessimistic about justice. Since Christians believe that all of us are sinful and can only be reconciled with God through the sacrifice made by Jesus on our behalf, perhaps Christians have no hope for justice here on earth. And since those who have accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior are promised that we'll be united with God forever, we are promised an eternal existence with God in heaven, perhaps Christians really don't need to worry about justice. In one sense, Christians are indeed pessimistic. Christians believe that we simply are not capable of producing justice on our own. But I hope you will agree that Christianity offers a compelling vision for how we might work to improve justice in all of the ways that I've been describing. This vision explains why Christians are so passionate about bringing an end to sex trafficking and other violations of human rights, as well as Christians' involvement in other campaigns for justice. And Christians are very optimistic about the ultimate future of justice. The Bible teaches that the universe was good when God created it. The Bible says that the heavens declare the glory of God. This is in Psalm 19. And that God promises to restore the beauty and the justice for which the universe was originally intended. When I talk about the future of justice and the issues I've been talking about here in my book, I speculate about a lot of other issues as well. One of the issues I speculate about is whether there will be lawyers in heaven. In America, when I say that, most people in the audiences I'm speaking to howl with laughter at the thought that there could possibly be lawyers in heaven. I actually think there will be lawyers in heaven, and I can explain why in the Q&A if you're interested. It might take most of the Q&A to persuade you. But in addition to speculating about some of these kinds of issues, I also point out that because God is a God of justice, we are reflecting the Creator's own qualities back to Himself when we obey the law or work to make the laws more just. Even if we live in an unjust time or an unjust place, our contributions to justice, as small as those contributions may be and as unsuccessful as they may seem, may, Christians believe, have eternal significance. They may be part of what God is doing in the world as part of His eternal reclamation project. And as Jesus Christ Himself put it in another context, it's not possible for us to create a truly just society by ourselves, but for God, all things are possible. Let me stop there and hopefully take a few questions and talk about these things some more.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. We have some time now for questions, and as always, I give you 3 rules that we have to keep to, A, B, and C. A is, please be articulate. You have to speak clearly, and we have a couple of mics and a very small army of 2 people with these mics. So if you want to ask a question, please make sure that you have a mic before you ask it. So that's A, be articulate. B is, please be brief. This is not your time to give your great political speech on the law, but please think of your question carefully and formulate it in the sweetest and shortest form that you can, and make sure it's just 1 question and not about 5. And then C is please be centered. In other words, please focus on the topic at hand. Please make sure that your question comes out of the talk that was, and not some sort of random question. So those are the 3 rules, A, B, C, be articulate, be brief, and be centered. So let's have time for questions now. So put your hands up if you have a question. There's 1 question there, the lady in the yellow top. Any other questions? And there's a question from the gentleman here in the front as well. So we have 2 mics. So. No, come in the front here. If you can keep your hand up, then we can find you. You have to keep your hand up, otherwise we can't spot you. Right, the lady in the yellow.
Hello. Thank you so much, Professor Skeel. Actually, today I almost purchased your book at the Hong Kong U Library. I'm running out of money for this month. Anyway, but in any case, my question is going to be brief, following the ABC direction from Professor Daniel Chua. questions about gay marriage. Because the reason I asked about this, because everyone is questioning about this. And
Absolutely.
then for me, it's important because I live in San Francisco for many years. I've seen this debate, and I have friends who are gay, but at the same time, we say we love the person, but we hate the sins. And of course, in the Bible, it's very, very strict in terms of what is right and wrong. And then there shouldn't be any confusions on that. And then please, yeah, that's just my very brief question.
So it figures that I'm always terrified that I'm going to get this question in American audiences where it's all we think about in America is same-sex marriage, and I rarely get the question. So I come to Hong Kong, and the first question I get is about same-sex marriage. So I have, as won't surprise you, I've thought about this issue a lot. It's a very, very difficult issue. It's an issue everywhere, I think. It's particularly an issue in the United States. And so I have a several-part answer to the question. Fortunately, Daniel did not say I have to obey A, B, and C, but I'll try to obey A, B, and C. So the first thing I'll say, which is very important, I think, in an American context particularly, is I believe that the traditional understanding of marriage, which is the understanding that I believe to be most consistent with the Bible, I believe that it's intellectually defensible. I think that there is an argument for traditional marriage being different from other kinds of relationships. That is highly contested in the U.S. to even make a statement like that. I do believe that traditional marriage is intellectually defensible. You know, we can disagree about whether it's right or whether it's wrong, but I think it can be intellectually defended. It is also the case, and this is the second part of my answer, in the United States, as a matter of secular law, not what happens in churches, but as a matter of secular law, the battle's over in the United States. So people that hold to a traditional view of America, of marriage in America, when I talk to them, I say, you need to understand that the political battle is over. Within the next 5 years, same-sex marriage will be, it'll be legal in every American state. It's now legal in many of them, but not all of them. Those who hold to a traditional view of marriage, which includes many Christians, not all Christians, but many, and probably most, need to accept that that battle is a matter of secular law. And so those who want to persuade American society that the traditional view of marriage is the normative understanding of marriage and that traditional marriage is different from other forms of marriage, need to demonstrate that the traditional view of marriage is the right view. So in my view, Christians should not be fighting the secular battle about whether there's going to be same-sex marriage or not. That battle's over. On the other hand, I think Christians quite legitimately can say, in our churches, we ought to have the right to adhere to a traditional view of marriage. So we shouldn't be forced, our ministers should not be forced to perform marriages that are inconsistent with their religious beliefs. And so I think it's perfectly appropriate for Christians in America to defend their ability to practice a traditional view of marriage within their churches. And I would strongly support that, and I write op-eds about that, about pluralism, and pluralism meaning that Christian churches ought to have the freedom to promote or to live out their understanding of proper marriage. Then the final piece of my answer is that Christians stick to a traditional view of marriage in their churches if that view is compelling and Christians have strong traditional marriages. In the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, other people will be persuaded that that is the best view of marriage. If it's not compelling, people will not be persuaded of that in the next 10 or 15 years. So it's a little bit of a complicated answer, but it ultimately is a complicated question, I think. And the short answer part of it is the secular battle in the United States is over. The battle with as far as what the law will recognize as marriage. Same-sex marriage is going to be the law of the land, and I'm personally okay with that. What happens going forward depends on what Christians do with their own marriages and their own churches, and whether the rest of American culture finds that compelling or not.
So, an easy question to begin with. Yeah. And there's another question there, yes. And then, yeah, we'll take that.
I thank you very much for your address. I appreciated that you put forward the concept of relation in justice. I mean, actually, in biblical scholarship nowadays, there is very much an understanding that justice in the Bible is a relationship concept between man and between man and God. My problem is another one. Christianity through history has gone through many stages and periods. And earlier Christians were perfectly happy with concepts which we abhor today. Torture, slavery, and even the concept of human rights was rejected at times when it came up, because people felt it was, at least on the continent in Europe, it was a product of the Enlightenment, which was an anti-Christian movement on the continent, at least. So how do we deal with that? I mean, Christianity in the past was different. That would not be the same as we see it today.
Yeah, so I'm waiting for the first easy question. I hope we're going to get to one before too long. That's another very difficult question, difficult for different kinds of reasons. So a couple different reactions I have to that question and thoughts I have about that question. One is, part of it is just about Christians having different views through history in particular. You're also suggested some of those views are problematic, but about views changing through history. My feeling about that is that the core of Christianity, in my view, does not change at all. So the core of Christianity, in my view, is the resurrection of Jesus. And the resurrection of Jesus being the only way we can be reconciled to God. On other issues, Christianity has changed through time, and I react to those changes in a couple of different ways. Just a quick footnote on it. I might push back against your characterization of human rights. I think the Christian contribution to human rights is very frequently underappreciated and sidelined unfairly, but we could talk about that another time. But with ideas that change through time, first of all, the core ideas don't change. On some other issues, I think our understanding does change, that God didn't just give us the Bible and show us the answers to every question immediately. The Bible is very clear about some issues. The biblical understanding of other issues, it seems to me, has been identified and developed and better understood by Christians, by the church, through time. And just to give an example or two of that, slavery is the most obvious example. That the Bible doesn't directly condemn slavery, but there are many things about the Bible, particularly the New Testament, that are simply inconsistent with slavery. And it treats slavery in a way that makes slavery impossible to justify. That's something that Christians wrestled with through time, and what is now completely clear to us now wasn't clear in the early centuries of the church. I wish Christians had reached the views that we have now immediately. I mean, the reality is that we didn't, but I'm not troubled by the fact that we understand some things more fully now than we understood at the time the Bible was first written. And there are other things that are like that as well. The nature of the Trinity, the three persons of God, was not completely clear, I think, to early Christians. It became more clear, and once you see it, it's obvious in the Bible. In the same way that once you see the problems with slavery, the Bible's hostility to slavery is quite obvious as well. So that's one answer. One answer is on some issues, our understanding does change through time, and I think we have a better understanding now than the first Christians might have had early on. And other ways, I think we need to recover some of the early Christians' understanding, such as their respect for the dignity of all people and the way they fought for the dignity of all people. The other thing I would say is that on some issues, I think that the progression isn't always good. In my view, and I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I'm sure they're there, and they're probably things because I'm living in this particular time, I might not be completely sensitive to. But on those issues, my point about Christianity being self-correcting comes into play. Although Christians can be wrong about things, and wrong for a long period of time because we are quite fallible as individual Christians, Christianity, I deeply believe, is self-correcting, that the kinds of things that you would identify, like human rights, for instance, it may be that some Christians at some times didn't respect human rights, but you can't get there from the Bible itself. It's a misreading of the Bible that gets you there. So the two main things I would say about change through time is there are some things we understand better as a church, as the church works through an issue through time. On other things, the church just has made mistakes, but the one solace is that Christianity, in my view, is self-correcting. Those mistakes are not permanent.
Right, let's see whether we have any more difficult questions.
Yeah,
for you.
I'll try to answer.
Who has the
them
mic? There's one person with a mic there, and who has the other mic? Oh, and there's a person with the other mic there. Okay, that's great. So,
thank you, Daniel. Great talk, David. Thank you very much. I just want to try and nail you down a little bit on your thesis specifically. If I understood your comments correctly, you seem to sort of lay out an analogy where we have the law for centuries and centuries, which is a wonderful aspiration. Unfortunately, it breaks down at the point of application. And sort of parallel to that, we have religious doctrine, which has been there as a potential form of redemption, sort of parallel to the law, but that too breaks down at application. And you talked about some examples of that, and people can think of plenty of their own. So in either case, we have sort of a good idea that fails when we have to apply it. And then you conclude that one is somehow better than the other, when they seem to be really 6 of one, half dozen of the other. So maybe you can just zero in on that.
Another really easy question. So I'm not sure if I'm going to hit this head on, because you're putting a gloss on what I said, which I think makes sense of what I said. It's not the way I was thinking about these issues, but what you're saying I think is quite plausible. So what I would say is an initial reaction, and you can come back to me if I'm not really getting at your question, is that the way you look at these issues, and I'm thinking particularly about the law. I definitely was making the points about the law, and I'm thinking about secular law in particular. What you're saying about religious doctrine is I'd have to think about a little bit more, and I think that's coming out of the exchange we just had, I take it. But what I said about law, the way you view law, the way you understand the possibility of creating justice through law or through a political process has a big effect on both the risks and the success and the risks of the system that you end up with. Now, that was kind of opaque the way I said that. But your understanding of the law, different understandings of the law inevitably lead to different ways of using the law and different expectations for the law. what I'm concerned about in this talk, in the chapter in the book about this, with typical secular understandings of the law, is that they're too optimistic about the law. And when we're too optimistic about the law, when we think we can use law, and you can substitute political system for this as well, there are a characteristic set of risks that you end up with. And the risk that I worry most about is that if you think you can create true justice just through having the right rules or the right political system, there will be a temptation to take matters into your own hands and to try to speed the process forward. And I'm really thinking from an American point of view here. Historically in America, we have often been very optimistic about the capacity of law. Right now, we're kind of optimistic about law. 100 years ago, we were optimistic about law. When we've been optimistic about law, what has tended to happen is people have tried to take law into their own hands with some ugly consequences. And so the biggest example of this 100 years ago was eugenics. Eugenics was a movement, there was a belief in the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States that we were on the verge of creating a perfect society. Once that we had dealt with slavery, eliminated slavery, there was an optimism that the United States was the promised land and that we were on the verge of creating a perfect society. There was a social Darwinist eugenics movement that said, because we're on our way to creating a perfect society, we should worry about inferior races and whether they are having children. We should worry about people who are mentally incompetent. And so people who were mentally incompetent were sterilized, so they couldn't have children. This played itself out in Nazism. So my concern is that if you're too optimistic about the law, that a kind of authoritarianism will take over, and it'll be a destructive authoritarianism. My vision of justice, which I believe is a Christian vision of justice, is a vision of justice that calls for much more modesty about what we can do with law and with a political system. It has its own risks. I mean, one of the risks is that it'll be too pessimistic about what we can do and what we can't do. So I think that gets at the political part of your question. I'm not sure if I completely got at the religious part. You know, maybe I would resist that part of the question and say I don't think there's a breakdown in doctrine. I do think that the core doctrines of Christianity do not change. They're essential. And in fact, in the book, I say my definition of what a Christian is somebody who believes Jesus was resurrected from the dead and that resurrection changed everything. Lots of other things Christians believe, some things Christians disagree about. In my view, that's the dividing line. I mean, there are problems within Christianity, but we can talk more later. I don't think I got 100% of your question, but hopefully I got 60%.
There's a question there.
Okay, hopefully this is an easy one since it's one you prompted yourself. What is the role for lawyers in heaven after the last judgment?
Yeah, those were lawyers that clapped there. Thank you. I'm not sure if it's easy because I don't think I'm going to persuade anybody of this. But so what I'm trying, the thought experiment there, what I'm trying to get people to think about is the possibility that there can be complexity without sin and without death. And it turns out that there actually is a little very interesting philosophical literature on this, which I talk about a little bit in the book. And there are a number of secular philosophers have speculated about what would life be like if we lived forever. And they tend to take the position that it would very quickly become very boring. If we live forever, because death and the risk of death is essential to the complexity and the richness of life, the argument goes. I think that's not true. I can imagine complexity without sin and a life that involves all the serendipity and surprise and different choices with different consequences that we have now that just doesn't involve sin. So what do lawyers have to do with that? Well, what lawyers have to do with that is what lawyers do, or what many lawyers do when they're not sinning and obstructing justice and creating problems, is they help people to navigate complexity. So that if you want to build something here in Hong Kong, if Hong Kong is anything like New York or Philadelphia where I am, you probably need a lawyer to help you navigate through the different permissions and things you need to build, to build something. Some of that is stuff that wouldn't be present in a perfect world, but some of it is stuff that would be present in a perfect world, I think. And very interesting thing I've discovered recently, a student of mine is doing a dissertation with the history department at Penn on early American lawyers. And one of the things that he's discovered is that most of them were not litigators. They weren't going to court all the time. They were doing what we call a transactional practice, helping people deal with the various complexities of their daily lives. That's what American lawyers did 200 years ago. And so that's part of the case for why there would be lawyers, why there will be lawyers in heaven. And I should concede that even my fellow Christian lawyers sometimes disagree with me and believe that we're going to have to be recovering lawyers in heaven. But I think there'll be lawyers in heaven.
Good. My wife's a lawyer, so. So let's have some questions, maybe from the back. We haven't had some, let's see. Is there a student anywhere? That was the question. Anyway, let's go right to the back. There's a lady right at the back. And then.
Thank you. Don't know if I count, but I just graduated from Penn actually this past May.
Who did?
Myself.
You
I graduated.
Did?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Anyway, I just wanted to ask about, I don't know if you have been keeping up with the Occupy Central movements in Hong Kong and the general political situation. So some of my Christian friends are very passionate about the issue, and they care a lot about whether people get to have their right to vote or not. Just wanted to know what might be some lines that Christians would like to draw when they are involved in the Christian, in both a secular as well as non-secular discussion of political issues. Yep.
So another easy question, and if I were smarter, I would say, I don't have an answer to that question, but I am going to answer the question. So the first thing I should say is I'm not from here, and I don't know the nuances. What I have discovered, I've been here since Tuesday, and what I have discovered is it's a very complicated situation, and as you said, even within Christians, there are folks on all sides of the issue. And for me, not knowing the issue, so I'm not in a position to really have a position about it, it's in a way not surprising that there are different views. And the reason it's not surprising is there's a tension in the Bible, and I think the tension is in the Bible because it is a tension in our experience of the world between the very strong call for Christians to obey the law and to recognize that secular rulers are put in place by God, that God superintends secular government, that secular government is ordained by God. So there's that strand in the Bible, and you probably know it's Romans 13, for instance, is a key reference there. There's also a strand in the Bible that suggests that unjust systems need to be challenged. So people will talk about how Jesus cleared out the temple because of the abuses that were taking place in the buying and selling of animals for sacrifices in the temple. And there are other examples you could give as well. So there's a real tension here between we are called to obey the law and to treat the rulers, our rulers, as there by God's grace. At the same time, we're mindful of the fact that we're human, we're sinful, and the law is not always just. And so there's a tension there. It's a tension that's been wrestled with throughout Christian history. My own tradition is the Reformed tradition in Protestantism, which goes back to John Calvin. John Calvin wrestled with this issue. He believed that rulers need to be respected, but he also considered the possibility that they won't always be ruling justly, that they may be ruling in a way that is ungodly or not consistent with biblical principles. So as an outsider who doesn't know anything about the details, I've seen the umbrellas, I've seen the tents, And I've been in lots and lots of conversations about it. It is a very complicated situation, it seems to me. But I think there's a tension because people are on different sides of this. Some people feel that this is a case where rulers need to be respected. Other people are of the view that this doesn't seem completely just, and so it's in the other category. That's me as an outsider not knowing exactly what's going on, and lots of people in this audience could probably say more intelligent things about it than I can. But that's been my reaction. It's a really interesting and important situation.
Okay, a simple question here. Have you come across or make comparison of any other legal systems which is not Christianity-based or originated, but you find this legal system by far the closest to Christian core value? This is the first question. And related question would be, how would you engage a China lawmaker while they think they can have their own way of doing justice within the system?
And which is going to be the easy question that you promised? So have I, the first part is, have I engaged other legal systems that are not oriented toward Christian, or do not come out of Christianity in the same way? So my expertise is primarily U.S. law. I do U.S. Corporate law, bankruptcy, financial distress. I do some other areas as well. And so the system I know best is the American system, which obviously is influenced by Christianity. I have some knowledge of other systems. I know a little bit about Chinese corporate law. I know a little bit about Japanese law. In each of those, it's a little bit complicated because it's not that they're completely unaffected by Christianity. It's just that Christianity is not the base influence. That the base influence is elsewhere. So I'm not an expert in another system that is coming from a Confucian point of view or a Buddhist point of view. For instance. So how would I engage a system, another system coming from another set of views? Because I believe that the Bible is true and that it is the best explanation of the way the universe works, I'm optimistic that my understanding of what the Bible says about justice and about law and about the way they work will resonate with people from other systems. So I am of the view that, this is speculating because I don't know the other systems, but I'm of the view that if you looked at another legal system, if you looked at the Chinese legal system, you would find at bottom it's wrestling with the trade-off between liberty and equality. And that the legal system is about relationship and understanding. Certainly what little I know about Confucianism is heavily relationship-oriented. And so from that perspective, I would think there are real points of contact. And so that's what I would say. I mean, I would say, I guess one more thing I would say is, one of the things that makes these conversations difficult is abuses in the name of Christianity. What we Christians did from America 100 years ago when we came to China and when we came to other countries, not all of it was bad in my view, but some of it was, and there was a tendency, there's inevitably a tendency, I think, or there's often a tendency to think what's American is also Christian, without separating those two things out. And that complicates this discussion as well. But my view, Christianity is true, and so the principles I see in Christianity, I think we're going to find, I would find elsewhere. And I would welcome those kinds of conversations. In fact, one of the things I'm hoping to do in the next couple of years is teach a class inspired by a theologian named Miroslav Volf, who's spoken here for the Faith Initiative, inspired by a class of his called What is the Good Life? That will have Buddhists, Christians, Hindus, each people from each perspective talking about these issues and seeing where the points of contact are. And I'm not sure if I answered all of your second question, but.
Thank you. The mic is over there now. Okay, yes.
I have a question that is more or less a follow-up to the question that was asked by the lady in the back there. You mentioned Martin Luther King. And in that respect, I recall something I read about him when I was younger. and that is his view about the rule of law. This is something I've just pulled out from the internet. I recall this is also something I read in the past. An individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. I liked your view about what he said, and also in the context of civil society, what do you think should be done about civil disobedience?
Phew, another easy question.
Nothing's easy.
So the Martin Luther King example is a fabulous example, and I don't know if what you were quoting comes from his letter from a Birmingham jail, but that's the logic of the letter from the Birmingham jail. Anybody in this room who has not read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, I would highly, highly commend it to you. It's one of the most remarkable documents. In my view, the two greatest documents written in American political life, I'm not even answering your question, but I just can't resist, are Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address during the Civil War and Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. They're the two most important American political documents or writings in American history. So I think what Martin Luther King said in Letter from a Birmingham Jail is quite compelling, and it's worth noting that he was speaking from a deeply Christian perspective. He was thinking about this from a Christian perspective. He was particularly influenced by Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic theologian, and just to repeat what you said, he said, an unjust law isn't a law, was one of the things he said, so that was a basis for civil disobedience. But he also said that he respected the law, and he respected that he was under the law, so he was willing to go to jail. He was willing to pay the penalty for violating the law. I think that's extremely powerful, and I agree with him completely about that. One thing to say is that civil disobedience is very coercive, and so it can be misguided. And not all civil disobedience is good civil disobedience. It's in the same way that boycotts are, it is a form of boycott. They're coercive, and often we think we know, when civil disobedience is right and when it's wrong. It's not always right, in my view. But the basic principles that King laid out, I think, are spot on. That an unjust law, it's appropriate to challenge an unjust law, that an unjust law is not law. In the way that we would say the laws of Nazi Germany were not real laws. They were laws, they were effective, but that was not genuine law. It's also the case that those who civilly disobey are civilly disobedient, in my view, ought to be willing to pay the price. You ought not take the position that you shouldn't be thrown in jail for engaging in civil disobedience. So that's the way I think about that. I do think the civil rights movement in America, at least from an American perspective, it's the best illustration of all of these principles. It was coercive. There were some elements of it that you might say, probably it overstepped in this place. But given the history of American slavery, the history of American segregation, the disenfranchisement of blacks, it was entirely appropriate in my view. And that document is just a remarkable document.
Where is the mic now? Okay, there's a lady here that's been dying to ask a question, and maybe we can find someone in the back as well that may have a question. Okay.
You did mention just now that perfect justice can't be achieved on this earth, from a Christian worldview, and however there is this. However, working towards achieving more justice would be a reflection of justice, which is an attribute of God. However, this would like create this spectrum of different views as to whether Christians have this duty to effect change against like systematic injustice. Some may like think since there won't be perfect justice, then Earth isn't exactly the battleground to Christians. And some will think we have a positive duty towards like making this world a better or like more just world. What do you think is a matter of like personal calling, or is there a more of a guidance in the Bible?
Another really easy question. So I believe that as far as the personal guidance point or personal perspective, we might have different callings with respect to what our role in justice is, how actively to be involved in something, what to be involved in, what not to be involved in. I do not believe that a Christian perspective on justice is open to, I don't believe that there are different views on, or at least that there are different possibly correct views, and I may be taking too strong a position here, but I believe that Christians are called to justice. I believe that the longing that we have for justice, in the same way that the longing we have for beauty and the sense of beauty that we have, is something that God put in us and is a glimpse of what God intends for the universe. That this longing for perfect justice, this longing for beauty, is a glimpse of what God intends ultimately for the world. So I don't think that a Christian can properly take the position, I'm indifferent about justice. You know, what happens here on earth doesn't matter because God is going to take care of things later. I think that's a misunderstanding of the Bible. As I understand the Bible, what it says is that when God transforms the world, when Jesus Christ returns, as we're told he'll return, he's returning here. He's not returning somewhere else. He's returning to earth and transforming the earth so that justice is part of God's future for the world. And our participation in justice is part of our responsibility as stewards of this world now. And so the idea that we shouldn't care about justice, you know, it's not really our problem. There are some Christians that hold that view, just as there are some Christians that hold the view we shouldn't care about the environment because the world is just going to be burn up later. Anyway, in my view, that's a misunderstanding of the Bible. I believe that all Christians are called to care deeply about justice, and what our particular responsibility is might be different for different people, but our calling to justice is part of what it means to be a Christian.
I think we have time for just one last question, but I cannot remember where's the mic. Oh, it's over there. Okay, right.
Thank you very much for your talk. Actually, I have two questions. The first question is actually a follow-up question of the first question about gay marriage. You mentioned that for a Christian, Christianity may be able to handle the gay marriage issue by not fighting the political battle, but to promote the traditional view of marriage. But my question is, what is this kind of promoting traditional marriage, or is labeled or is turned into as a crime against human rights? What will happen, or what Christianity can do if simply promoting traditional view of marriage is classified as a crime against the human rights? This is my first question. Second question is from your talk. It seems that you think justice can never be achieved if simply by law alone, and it has always to be dealt with the hearts and minds of human beings, and obviously that is the part about the love and relationship. So it seems that it's a bit similar to the two philosophers or psychologists, the Lawrence Colbert and Carol Gilligan, they mentioned about justice and relationship. So my question will be, what is how your perspective in justice can be related to these two philosophers' thinking, and how can it be? How can your perspective can be promoted in the secular world? Thank you.
Those are two very interesting, very different questions. So on the first one of the possibility that a traditional view of marriage and promoting a traditional view of marriage will come to be seen as a violation of human rights, it seems to me what the issue there is, it's an issue of pluralism. And the question we're wrestling with greatly in the United States, and Europe is wrestling with this too, and I suspect it's being wrestled with here in Hong Kong as well, is what are the limits of pluralism? At what point do we not allow differences of opinion? At what point are differences of opinion not differences of opinion? It's just wrong to hold that opinion. There is, in my view, a possibility that adhering to a traditional view of marriage will come to be seen as beyond the pale, at least in the United States. I think that would be deeply unfortunate. I think that the challenge in the United States right now, in my view, is a challenge of whether we can adhere to pluralism, to a robust pluralism that suggests that it's important that we allow differences of opinion, even if we're offended by those differences of opinion, rather than trying to insist on one uniform view. And it's a real struggle in the United States. It's been a struggle in other areas in the United States for decades. So a big issue in the United States 30 or 40 years ago is whether neo-Nazis, people who are articulating a Nazi point of view, should be allowed to speak and hold rallies. We ultimately drew the conclusion that even though nearly every American finds that deeply offensive, that pluralism requires that we allow people to voice even views that we find offensive. I personally think it's very important that that be the conception of our life together. I'm thinking of the United States because that's what I know best, but I think I would say that anywhere, that I think pluralism is really, really important. When you start limiting pluralism, when you start saying some views are out of bounds, you're on the road to authoritarianism and to dictating what people believe and do, which I think is a really big mistake. On your second point, Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan, I'm tempted to say I don't know enough about their work to answer. I know a little bit about Carol Gilligan's work. I know a little bit about Kohlberg's work. I definitely know a little bit about Carol Gilligan's work. She was writing in a slightly different context. I mean, she was writing about relationship in society generally. She's famous for the view that women are better at relationship than men are, and for a particular type of feminism, which many feminists disagree with. I mean, her views are somewhat controversial, even among feminists. But I do have a lot of sympathy for that view. I mean, for that kind of view, a view that there's something essential to who we are in relationship and in relationships, and that relationships are at the foundation of a properly operating society, whether we're just talking about our neighborhoods and our communities or whether we're talking about our legal system. So from that perspective, I have a lot of sympathy for that point of view. I do think that promoting relationship is what the law ought to be doing. We shouldn't be too optimistic about how much we can do, but things like the civil rights laws promoted relationship. And I'll give you one other example which will seem crazy to you and is different when you get outside of of America, but I write about bankruptcy. I think the American bankruptcy system for individuals who are overwhelmed by debt, who have more debt that they can pay off, I think it promotes relationship, that the idea that individuals who are overwhelmed by debt ought to have an opportunity for a fresh start. I believe that enables people who are crushed by debt to reestablish a place in the relationships in our community that's quite valuable. And I have lots more I could say about that because I'm a bankruptcy nerd. But I do think that at bottom, when we think about law, we should think about the trade-off between equality and freedom or liberty, and think about that in the framework of relationship and our relationships within a society.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but before we go, I want to say thank you very much, David, for a wonderful session and for answering all those crazily difficult questions. Thank you very much. You can go and eat now.
Those are all the questions that you're terrified of getting.